Good morning to you. You. Good morning, good morning to you. Good morning, good morning. Won't you share with a friend or two? Good morning, good morning to you. You. Good morning. Good morning to you and many more and many more. Good morning, good morning, good morning, and welcome to Daring Dialogues. I am your host, Shantae Charles. It has been quite, quite an eventful Black History Month. While we have been intent on celebrating and remembering the lives and remembering the stories of those who have gone before us that can inform us of today and how we should move in today's world, we know that there have been people who have been intent and bent on doing the exact opposite. But that has not stopped us from celebrating the abolitionists, the freedom seekers, celebrating literacy, celebrating all the ways that African American families tried to keep themselves together, celebrating the abolitionists, celebrating those who were seeking freedom by whatever means necessary. And so I want you to think about that for this past month. For us, Black History is every single day. It's 365, 24/7. We are trying to share in our space something of significance from Black history. And if we're not doing Black history, we are sharing with you authors and books written by Black scholars and psychologists. So for us, when we say Black history, we're really talking about all year round. This is a national, sort of way of remembering what Black people have done. But the reality is, um, it's our responsibility to hold fast and to keep up with, right? To keep up with um, all that we have done and all that we have accomplished. So, one thing I want to do is I want to share a couple of things. One, the fact that I'm wearing this on my shirt, embrace your roots. I'm going to talk a little bit about my roots today. Um, One, I'm going to start off with, I'm trying to find my obituary for my other family member here, but it doesn't seem like it's on here. I'm not sure. I see in memory of, I see notes, but I don't see the other part of it. Let's see. I'm trying to see if I can find it online. Okay. I can't find that one, but I'll tell you a little bit about her. So I want to celebrate the lives of both of my grandmothers. They were close friends. I don't necessarily, I saw them as best friends growing up, but I would say close friends. Um, and my father's mother, Leary Davis, and my mother's mother, Ruth Page. Now, I have her obituary here with me, and I wanted to show it to you because it's such a well, beautifully done thing. And that was my mother's mother. She's indigenous. And I want to say something really briefly to people who are celebrating their families, celebrating the memories of their families. My husband actually designed this particular obituary, um, but obituaries can become keepsakes. And the way that we designed this one was for any member who got it, they could actually take this to be framed and they could hang it up. So these are images of my family, our generations, and there's my grandmother and her sisters. And so I want to encourage people that if you are doing things like obituaries, obituaries can serve as a keepsake. It can also serve as a memorial. If you are building a place of remembrance in your house, you can use them in that place of remembrance. And then something that we did that a lot of people said they've never seen done before is we had an insert card which gave the order of service, but then also we have a genealogy card on the flip side. So this starts with her parents, Henry Harrison George and Leela Bertha Sloan George. So it starts with my grandmother's parents, where she was born, all of her siblings. She had 11 siblings. Then her children and their children, her children and their children, her children and their children, all the way down. And then it we gave some codes down at the bottom: who was deceased, who was a spouse, who was a child, who was a grandchild, who was a great grandchild. And then it talks about who compiled it and who it was recorded by. So that people walked away with not just the obituary, our family members now have a genealogy page. And so your younger children don't have to go around asking who was who and what was who named and who's whose child and all of that. We combined the two. So I want to read you about my grandmother, Missionary Ruth Page. Born April 8, 1920, to Henry Harrison George and Layla George in Bogue Township, Columbus County, North Carolina, Ruth Page attended Liberty Hill Negro Grade School and Chadbourne Negro High School. Raised in a farming family in Welch's Creek, Whiteville, North Carolina, Ruth enjoyed sewing and was very gifted at it. She dreamed of becoming a nurse and spent time volunteering in various centers as a missionary. She spent time in Wilmington, North Carolina, and Washington, D.C., and spent the majority of her years in the South Florida community of West Perrine. Missionary Ruth Page impacted the lives of many both nationally and locally. She worked tirelessly behind the scenes in governmental affairs, both praying for presidents and advocating for policies and programs that directly impacted South Florida residents. She sat on and served in many presidential advisory councils. Ruth was instrumental in bringing the very first Head Start program and healthcare services to South Florida and was a recipient of the Miami Herald Charles Whitefield Spirit of Excellence Award in 2000. When Hurricane Andrew struck the South Florida residents of West Perrine in 1992, Ruth Page's experience in nursing and lifelong survival training kicked in. Her efforts to bring fresh drinking water to residents, especially the elderly, was recognized by the county and city officials through proclamation. After Hurricane Andrew, she took photographs of our destroyed school, R.R. Moten Elementary, and presented to the school board, advocating for the school to be rebuilt and not moved out of the neighborhood, becoming instrumental in portables being installed until the rebuilding of the school could occur, which still stands today. Missionary Ruth taught arts and crafts at the Jackson Manor Nursing Home and collected petitions for a tot lot there. She served as an activist counselor in the community and as a member of the CAAA and the CDC, the Community Development Corporation. Ruth volunteered at the psychiatric ward at Jackson Memorial Hospital and taught arts and exercise at the West Perrine Senior Citizen Center. Missionary Ruth worked diligently on the leadership team of the Miami Metro Action Plan, courting community investors, both national and international, to bring economic and business opportunities to local business owners in our small black town. Ruth volunteered as a mentor and teacher assistant at Richmond Perrine Optimist Club, Perrine Elementary, and the PLP program at Naranja Elementary and R.R. Moten Elementary School for more than 27 years. She and other community leaders were honored with a mural in our community, African American Women in the Struggle, in the Housing Development Perrine Gardens, also known as Circle Plaza, in tribute to their work. Whether on her three-wheel bike or on foot, whether caring for the elderly or offering prayers and sustenance to the addicted, whether standing before a school board or a church congregation, whether speaking to dignitaries or children at the corner store, from the White House to the outhouse, Missionary Ruth Page was the epitome of love in action. She was the hands and feet of her Savior, Christ Jesus. At the tender age of 13, Ruth testified that God had told her to do His will until she was called home. Her life well lived exemplifies the commission carried out. Whew. So I'm getting choked up um, reading about my grandmother and her legacy. Her legacy lives on in the hearts of the lives she touched, and family, friends, and colleagues. Whew. And co-laborers who knew her love for God and service to mankind. Excuse me. Needless to say, needless to say, I have great love and admiration for the example that my grandmother set. And when I look around today and I think about all of the people who came before us and the gains and the struggle that they endured to get us to where we are, and then I think about how people are in real time undoing those gains, it makes me appreciate the legacy that my grandmother left in terms of fighting for what you believe in and advocating for what you believe in and not backing down and seeing that example. But it also makes me really livid that there are so many people right now who may not understand the depth and the significance of what is happening in this moment. But it also makes me fired up to to continue my grandmother's legacy, my great grandmother's legacy, my great grandfather's legacy, and that's just one grandmother. My other grandmother, she was a sharecropper as a young girl, working with her mother who had been enslaved. her mother had been enslaved. And all she knew growing up until about the age of 13, was working the fields and sharecropping with her mother. So my grandmother's story picks up at sharecropping because that's where her mother left off, was at sharecropping. She moves to South Florida. She gets married. Her education um, stops at elementary, upper elementary. She is on assistance trying to help her children. Interestingly enough, she gets some jobs working in people's homes in South Florida. And one of those people happens to be a white minister. And that white minister gave her his church to live in. He actually said there weren't enough people attending, and so he closed down the church and gave her the church as her first home. So she turned that church into a home for her and her children, along with her husband at the time. And after that, they continued to live in that home through a community program. She wound up training to become an X-ray technician. She got off of public assistance, got her second home, and continued to raise her children after the death of her husband. She was raising 11 children by herself. My other grandmother was raising 11 children by herself. That's how they became friends. And then I entered into the picture. So to grow up with those two women as my examples, to see their friendship, to see them raising my uncles and my aunts by themselves, not picking up sugar daddies, to do the raising. That example for me, those are my heroes. Women who raised their families, women who organized in the community, women who were God fearing, women who said, I'm not going to let my circumstances determine my outcomes, women whose children went on to be college educated. And I'm just very thankful. I'm thankful for my own history. I'm thankful for my own story. Um, and I'm really thankful for that. And I hope that people will embrace their own roots. As much as we talk about Black history, I want you to think about, how are you embracing your own Black history? How are you embracing your own story? How are you encouraging the younger people that are coming after you in your family to learn about the people in your family that have done significant things, that have made history for your personal family? I want you to think about that. Today we're going to wrap up by reading Many Thousand Gone, African Americans from Slavery to Freedom. And we are still in the section called Running Aways. We're going to learn about some new people. We're going to hear about some people we know already, but maybe there are some things you don't know about their story. And then we're going to end there. The Captain of the Pearl. Daniel Drayton, captain of a ship called the Pearl, was one of many seamen who got involved in smuggling fugitives out of slavery. In 1847, he sailed into Washington Harbor with a cargo of oysters. At the dock, a black man asked him if he would be so kind as to take a woman and her 5 children north. The woman was an enslaved person who had paid her owner for her freedom, said the man. But the slave owner refused to give her her freedom papers and was threatening to sell her to the dreaded Deep South. Captain Drayton allowed the woman, her 5 children, and her niece to stow away on board. Without any trouble, he took them to the north, where the woman's husband was waiting for her. Thus, Drayton became a conductor on the secret invisible railroad that now stretched out over the ocean. In 1848, he docked in Washington and prepared to take on a large group of runaway enslaved persons. While the city celebrated the newly established Second Republic of France with speeches and a torchlight procession, the enslaved were left more or less to themselves. That is how so many of them, 78 in all, were able to escape onto the Pearl, which sailed at midnight. The ship reached the mouth of the Potomac River, and then the wind began to turn against it. Captain Drayton, his crew, and the hidden cargo had to hole up 150 miles from Washington. The escape by then had been discovered, and there was great excitement over the disappearance of 78 enslaved people at one time. A steamer with armed men on board came after the Pearl and brought it back to Washington. An angry mob waited there to greet Captain Drayton and his crew. All of the fugitives, worth more than $100,000 as property, were arrested. The male slaves were shackled by twos into a coffle, a human train, and whipped through the streets. The female enslaved followed behind. All were jailed as runaways. 50 of them were sold to the local dealer to be auctioned. Scores of indictments were brought against Captain Drayton and his crew. 2 trials were held, and the accused were found guilty and given harsh sentences. They would remain in jail until the combined fines of $228,000 were paid. Captain Drayton's own fine was $10,060, at the time a large amount that could cause him to be jailed for life. But 4 years later, Drayton's friends persuaded President Millard Fillmore to pardon Drayton and all of those in his crew who had been sentenced. The enslaved, however, were lost back into the slave system. Sold and resold, they continued to labor and pass away unless by some miracle they found a chance to run again. As a result of the Drayton incident, slave state representatives in Congress demanded a stronger Fugitive Slave Act. Solomon Northup. Solomon Northup's father was given freedom through the legal will of his owner. Solomon was born free in 1808 in New York and grew up knowing next to nothing about enslavement. He married and lived for a time in Saratoga, New York, where in the evenings he played violin at social gatherings. By the day, he worked in the hotels. One day, Solomon met 2 men who were managers of a traveling circus. They asked him to join them as a musician. He agreed, and though he soon felt the managers acted oddly, he did stay on with the circus for a time. One night, after a deep and possibly drugged sleep, he woke up in a place called Williams Slave Pen. This was a holding house for enslaved people and was in sight of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. The managers of the circus were also enslavement catchers of a particular kind. They were bounty hunters who received rewards of money from slave owners for capturing their runaway slaves. These bounty hunters were sometimes afraid to bring their cases to court under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. They feared that their often flimsy proof of ownership would not stand up. It didn't matter to them what black person they were bringing back, as long as the man, woman, or child fit the general description. The owner didn't care either, and he would give the reward as soon as he got back a slave. The bounty hunters would watch a black person for a time, waiting for a chance to carry out their plans by trickery. Such was the unfortunate experience of the freeman Solomon Northup in 1830. Even though Solomon had never been enslaved, he was handed over to a harsh slave owner in the South, Edwin Epps, and he became a slave laboring on the Epps plantation. Years later, he wrote that he slept on a plank 12 inches wide and 10 feet long. My pillow was a stick of wood. The bedding was a coarse blanket and not a rag or shred beside. Though luck is rare in such cases, eventually Solomon Northup was lucky. A northerner called Bass, who worked at the plantation, befriended Solomon and wrote to northern friends about him. The Bass letters reached Solomon's wife, Anne Northup, who petitioned the governor of New York. He in turn was concerned and interested enough to send an agent to find Solomon. Citing the 1840 New York law against kidnapping, the governor's agent was able to get Solomon back to New York, even though Epps tried to prevent it. And in 1853, 23 years after he was kidnapped, Solomon Northup was finally free. Now, we call that, I believe that story is based on 12 Years a Slave, the film. Most of us know, or should know, Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. After his birth in 1817, Frederick Bailey was separated from his mother. He lived on a Maryland plantation with his grandmother. He had so little to eat as a child that he often had to fight the dogs in the yard over bones with meat on them so he wouldn't starve. He was 8 years old when his owner sent him to Baltimore as a house servant for the family of Hugh Auld. Auld's wife broke the law by teaching Frederick to read and write. Her husband stopped her, saying that learning would only make her slave child unfit for enslavement. He was right. Auld suddenly died, and Frederick was sent back to the plantation as a field hand. Later on, when he was a young adult, a Sunday school he started was shut down by angry white people. He was beaten and flogged for resisting the slave system. He was even whipped every 7 days for 6 months to break his spirit. But Frederick Bailey's spirit would not be broken. At 16, he was hired out on a ship. He and three other enslaved persons plotted to escape, but were found out before they could get away. 5 years later, in 1838, Frederick disguised himself as a sailor and made good his escape. He found work as a laborer in New York City and then in New Bedford, Massachusetts. At that point, Frederick Bailey changed his name to Frederick Douglass. Soon he would become the most renowned ex-enslaved person of all time. In 1841, now married, Frederick began talking about his experience as an enslaved person at meetings of the anti-slavery societies. It wasn't long before he found his true calling as an orator and leader in the Freedom Crusade. His style and grace with words and his appearance put him in the forefront of the movement. He became the lecturer for the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. He spoke across the country against enslavement and straightforwardly told about his life as a slave to rapt listeners. But he was still a fugitive, and he was always in danger of being recognized and caught as he traveled. Not all the people who heard him were sympathetic to the cause. In Indiana, a white mob beat Douglas senseless and left him for dead. Yet he revived and went on recounting and denouncing the evils of slavery. In 1845, he wrote an account of his life. Friends had asked him not to write it, fearing he would be found out as a runaway called Bailey. A biography was published entitled Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. Soon afterward, Douglass was recognized as Frederick Bailey, and he had to leave the country. He went to England where he raised enough money from lecturing to buy his freedom. 2 years later, he returned to America as a free man. In 1847, Douglass started his own abolitionist newspaper, the North Star. It was dedicated to the cause of freedom for oppressed blacks. It shall fearlessly assert your rights, he wrote in his first editorial, faithfully proclaim your wrongs, and earnestly demand for you instant and even-handed justice. Giving no quarter to slavery at the South, it will hold no truce with oppressors at the North. Douglass's most famous speech came at the Fourth of July celebration in Rochester, New York in 1852. Fellow citizens, he began, pardon me and allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I, or those I represent, to do with your national independence? What to the American slave is your Fourth of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days of the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery, a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. Frederick Douglass was forced to flee to Canada when the governor of Virginia issued a warrant for his arrest, charging that he had conspired with abolitionist John Brown in the 1859 slave revolt at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Douglass did meet with John Brown, but only to advise him to give up his plan. He strongly opposed it and was not a conspirator. He didn't think it would work. John Brown was tried, convicted, and hanged in December 1859. Douglass stayed out of the country until the Virginia arrest warrant expired and the political climate in America had changed. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Douglass was certain that it would bring an end to enslavement. He had two interviews with President Lincoln about recruiting black soldiers for the Union armies, an idea he strongly supported. Two of his own sons were the first recruits, and Douglass helped enlist the men of the celebrated 54th and 55th Massachusetts Negro Regiments. Douglass went on to write another biography, Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. He held public office as U.S. Marshal of the District of Columbia and then was named Minister to Haiti. On the day of his death, February 20th, 1895, the North Carolina legislature held a day's adjournment in respect for his passing. He had been the leading black spokesman in America for half a century. And we're going to end with the bravest conductor that most people know. She was called the greatest conductor on the Underground Railroad. The enslaved named her Moses because, like the biblical Moses, she led her travelers from bondage to freedom. Araminta was the name given her, which she changed to Harriet after her mother. She was born into slavery in about 1820 in Dorchester County, Maryland, one of Harriet and Benjamin Ross's 11 children. As an enslaved child, Harriet grew up with little time for play and no schooling. Instead, she had plenty of work and many beatings by her owner. Sometimes during her youth, Harriet Ross was hit on the head with a heavy weight thrown by her owner at someone else trying to escape. The severe blow caused her to fall asleep whenever she was quiet for longer than 15 minutes. She thus became physically active to keep herself awake. As she grew older, Harriet did not often live with her owner. He hired her out to work for various people. This was a common practice. When an owner no longer needed the services of one of his enslaved, he rented them out to someone who did. When she was in her 20s, word reached Harriet that she and two of her brothers were to be sold. She ran away believing she had a right to liberty or death. One or the other I mean to have, she said. She made a successful escape and found her way into free Pennsylvania. Once free, Harriet stared at her hands to see if she was the same person out of enslavement as she had been in it. She surely felt different. There was such a glory over everything, she said. The sun come like gold through the trees. Unfortunately, Harriet had to leave behind her brothers and her husband, John Tubman, who said he would report her if she ran. Yes, Harriet's own husband said he would report her if she ran. Later, she did go back for him, but he had already remarried. As John Tubman seeped out of her wounded heart, the woman known to history as Harriet Tubman devoted herself to the freeing of others. She went about establishing a network of stations from the South all the way into Canada, making more than 20 dangerous journeys into the South to do so. She returned for her brothers and brought them out. She took her elderly mother and her father north. Over her lifetime, Harriet Tubman brought out more than 300 enslaved persons along the Underground Railroad. Rewards for her capture posted by owners from whom she liberated the slaves finally reached the sum of $40,000. But Harriet thought of everything. She hired someone to follow the man who posted descriptions of runaways. Once the man left the area, Harriet's assistant tore all the posters down. She carried a pistol at all times and a potion to quiet fugitive children if they began to cry. If the runaways she led were too fearful and wanted to turn back, she would point her pistol at them. You go or you die, she would say. None ever died. I never run my train off the track, said Harriet proudly. Harriet Tubman became a heroine to the abolitionists. Northern anti-slavery leaders such as Thomas Garrett were always eager to help her with food, money, or lodging. She herself helped abolitionist John Brown, who called her General Tubman, in recruiting men for the uprising he led at Harper's Ferry. In the 1850s, Harriet appeared at many meetings and also began speaking out on women's rights. Because of the huge price on her head, she was forced to flee to Canada just before the start of the Civil War. But she did return to America in 1862 and served as a spy, as a scout, and a nurse for the Union Army in North Carolina. After the war, she turned her home into the Home for Indigent and Aged Negroes, which supported freed people. This is in Auburn, New York, and I actually got a chance to go to that home, and it's an amazing experience. I highly recommend it. She married Nelson Davis, a war veteran, in 1869. Harriet Tubman lived out much of her old age in poverty. Then, 30 years after the Civil War's end, she received a war widow's pension of $20 a month for the rest of her life. So humane was she that she used nearly all of her money to maintain her home, later known as the Harriet Tubman House, as a refuge for the needy. She died in 1913 at the age of 93. But what this doesn't tell you is that she bought about 30 acres of land in Auburn, New York, and that land is still there. And we got a chance to tour that land. She is also buried um, in a cemetery in Auburn, New York, and we also went to her grave to pay her respects. So I hope that you have enjoyed learning maybe a little bit more about people that you commonly hear about. And I hope you've picked up some knowledge of some new people this time around. I want to thank you for your time and attention. This concludes season 14 of Daring Dialogues. We're going to be taking a break for about a week, and then season 15 will begin March the 10th. When we come back in March, we'll be back to our regular readings, but we'll also be reading about, and I'll be sharing some facts with you about women for Women's History Month. All right. On my page at 12 o'clock today on Black Table Talk, we're going to be putting up a post about mutual aid help. We know that lots of people right now are doing the blackout today. They are not buying at regular retailers and all of that. But as we have said, on the other side of boycotting is mutual aid. So we're encouraging people to do something today for someone else. On our page today at 12 o'clock, we're going to have a time of mutual aid help. You just need to follow the instructions, and you must have a cash app in order to participate in that. Okay? Remember, light is the most daring opposition to darkness, so continue to go out and be light. Take care, be well, and most importantly, be light.